one of the things that we have been arguing and pushing for when the Trump administration said that it wanted to send National Guards and all these folks into these different cities, primarily, Democratic-led cities, the argument against that wasn't that the cities would not want the assistance. But the question was, why aren't you working with the city to come up with a coordinated effort for how best to protect everyone? So it raises the question about, what their true intent was here. And, Andreas, you live and work in Florida. It's a state with a significant Spanish-speaking population. So when you heard about this gaslighting, green lighting, to be able to, because a person looks like they're from, Spanish-speaking heritage, Latin heritage, that they would be able to immediately just stop them wherever they are, whatever they're doing. Whether they're breaking a rule, breaking a law or not, they can just stop them because I think you look like you might not be documented to be in the United States. Talk to us, Andreas. I mean, you're in Florida with this large speaking community. What has been the reaction of the members of the community? What is the reaction that you have?
Absolutely. So even before the Supreme Court case was decided in this way, we have been feeling the impact of this administration's efforts to systemically target Latin American and Spanish-speaking communities here in Florida. Not even a couple months ago, here in Tallahassee, in my town, in my college town, not even a mile from our campus, there was an ICE raid on construction site right by our campus. Students had to watch while workers who were working on building up our community were being rounded up and sent, put into unmarked vehicles, taken away, and that has led to a lot of fear in our communities. But also, I want to point out the feeling of betrayal that I think a lot of communities, specifically in the South Florida and Central Florida areas, are feeling now. This was an administration that campaigned on the idea of working with Spanish-speaking communities and advocating for Latin American communities, and then they get into office and completely go back on their word. Before the election, the Latin American community was swinging towards Trump. We saw that in the aftermath of the election, and now that community has done a complete 180 on this issue. They are completely against these ICE raids that are targeting the community members. They are completely against the work that the administration is doing now. And because of that, my fear is that we are going to be continuously targeted not just as ordinary residents of the state of Florida, but also Spanish-speaking organizers who are working here. We know that this is an administration that is working to target left-leaning organizations or organizations that work to benefit the community in some way, shape, or form. And this will only embolden the administration to target members of Spanish-speaking organizations who are working in the community against ICE raids, providing resources for the community. And I think that's something that we really need to be paying attention to, is how are we going to protect these organizations that are working in the community that will definitely be targeted by this administration?
Well, and that's a great question. How do we protect the organizations that are trying to work with the Spanish-speaking communities? But, one of the other pieces I want to ask you about, Andreas, is that when we're speaking of the Spanish-speaking communities throughout Florida and really throughout other parts of the country as well, one of the things that I anticipate is going to happen during this next election cycle is that you're going to see, because we've already seen an increase in funding for immigration, custom, and enforcement agents and enforcement activities, I suspect that we're going to see these ICE agents all around polling places trying to intimidate Spanish-speaking voters from coming to the polls to vote, whether or not they're concerned about them pulling them over based on, the Palermo case or whatever it is. There's going to be this intimidation that is going to suppress and certainly intimidate many of the Spanish-speaking voters that lawfully have the ability to vote, but are going to be, in fear because of what this decision and the atmosphere that's being created in the United States. Do you think I'm off on that? Am I right on that? Or are you seeing any evidence of that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct on that point, Daryl. I don't think that is something that we have seen being a systemic element of this administration yet. But we do have to be aware of the fact that this was happening even before this past election cycle with ordinary citizens who were emboldened by the rhetoric and the hateful language that this administration has been pushing out. This is something that we are going to have to be aware of, and ensuring that young people are educated on this issue, that they are not only registered to vote, but educated on their personal rights that they have as U.S. citizens, as legal residents of this country, is absolutely critical. Here in Florida, we have been distributing Know Your Rights cards. There are these little red cards that list out in English, Spanish, and Portuguese the rights and privileges that individuals who are maybe not citizens but legal residents of this country that they have. And we have to have an aggressive public education campaign because people cannot fight for their own rights if they're not educated on what those rights are.
Well, and Dr. McCrae, I'm predicting that this decision, and let me be clear, right? This decision, the Perdomo decision that we're talking about, came on the shadow docket from the Supreme Court, which means simply that there was a U.S. District Court judge in California that issued this stay saying that, look, ICE agents, y'all can't just be gathering up people because they look like they might be of Latin heritage or Hispanic heritage. Y'all can't just be gathering people because they have an accent and don't sound like you want them to sound, or they're working in a certain capacity, and therefore you can stop them and hold them and detain them until they can prove to you that they're in the country legal. That's what this Perdomo decision was saying. And when it went up to the Supreme Court, ordinarily, what would happen is that the U.S. District Court would make their decision, which they did here. They said that it didn't appear right to them what the agents were doing. It would go up to the U.S. Court of Appeals. It could make a decision, and then ultimately they could file a writ of certiorari for it to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. In this Perdomo decision, after the U.S. District Court judge made his decision, the Kristi Noem and them, as we say, and Kristi Noem and them, they went on and said, well, we're going to file something up to the Supreme Court and ask them to hear this right now and just skip this other stuff. And that's what they did, and that's how it got to the Supreme Court. So it goes on what we call the shadow docket because there isn't a full hearing on the case or anything like that. But the justices make a decision in the dark, if you will, and then that decision becomes binding on whether or not the stay in this action could stay in place. And so what the court here, and the Supreme Court did here, was that it decided that, there's a strong likelihood that what the district court judge did is wrong, right, is wrong, and saying that, you shouldn't be able to use these factors to make it stop. And the U.S. Supreme Court, by issuing the reversal of the U.S. District Court, is saying that there's a strong likelihood that we will side against the judge in this case, and saying that, what Kristi Noem and them were doing was the right thing in terms of trying to loosen and restrict the rights of people to walk around and when they can be stopped in their Fourth Amendment privileges. So, Dr. McCrae, I've got to ask you, when I start hearing about these Fourth Amendment stuff and people, certain rights don't apply based on how you look, right, how you sound, where you work, I don't see this stopping with the Latin American community, with the Latin or Spanish-speaking community. I can see African immigrants, Asian immigrants, Dominicans, all of them becoming part of this, except for white folks. I don't see where it would apply to them. Karen, are we creating a second class of citizens? What's going on?
Absolutely, and that's precisely what this ruling has done. It institutionalizes what many communities of color already know, that immigration enforcement isn't about who is undocumented. It's about who looks foreign. And for African immigrants, Asian immigrants, Dominicans, and other groups, it means more stops, more harassment, higher risk of wrongful detention, no free movement or speech, deepening racial divides, the extension of two-tier citizenship, and more importantly, it allows them, this ruling allows them to continue to use whiteness as a shield. There are more than 600,000 white folks, or folks who come from European countries, who have unexpired visas. This shields them. They don't speak Spanish for the most part. They speak other languages. This marker that was put down by the Supreme Court specifically creates an opportunity for continued racial profiling based upon what you look like, the language you speak, and they even mention if you have the likelihood of working a low-wage job. So they were very clear on how they were going to create this second-class citizenship. So yeah, this disproportionately affects people of color across the board, but more specifically, shield whiteness.
And Carl, you said earlier that we've been here before. I've always been suspect of the Supreme Court and the way that it puts its finger in the air to see which way the wind is blowing, so that it can make decisions. Tell me why you think this, or how you believe this decision is any different than the Dred Scott decision, where they said that the black man has no rights, that the white man is bound to respect. What's the difference? Isn't this really back to that?
Not only is it back to that, but we act like second-class status is a new phenomenon. African Americans have understood what it meant to be second-class citizens and fought a long battle to try to get equal rights in the society, a battle that's ongoing. But Daryl, one of the things that the late Joe Madison used to say, and I think many of us buy into, which is, now that we know what the problem is, what are we going to do about it? And what I want to do is suggest to the listening audience that there are some solutions. There's not a panacea. It won't solve all of our problems, but it will give us a starting point. I would invite people listening to the program to Google Emmett Till Security Alert System. Emmett Till Security Alert System. This is a system that was put together so that when people of color find themselves under threat, under danger, there are things that we collectively can do to protect ourselves. One of the things, and this can also apply to obviously our Latino brothers and sisters as well, we've got to begin to think about how do we respond. And we have to respond strategically, and we have to be smart in the way we respond. In my opinion, what Trump is attempting to do, and people have not used this term, but we're seeing fascism, not just racism, but fascism becoming a reality in this country. And for people who understand civil liberties and civil rights, this is not a time to just respond by saying, my God, this is terrible. It's time for those who understand what's coming to begin to plot and plan a way of dealing with what is happening. Daryl, you and I had a conversation offline, and I just want to make sure that everyone understands. At this very moment, the Trump administration is building one of the largest, they call it detention centers, in the nation's history. It's going to be in Texas. Again, people who understand history, it's not a far-fetched for people to understand that if you go back to the 40s, there was something called a detention center. The people who became the victims of that was Japanese Americans. They were interned. I can see a circumstance developing in this country where if it's all right to racially profile people, it is also appropriate to detain them. And you have a Supreme Court that I think is moving in that direction. So the notion that the Dred Scott decision, black people have no rights, that white people are bound to respect, I would go a step further and say this decision puts all Americans under a certain cloud. If you happen to be someone who considers yourself progressive, if you consider yourself liberal, if you are a registered Democrat, this particular administration is coming at you. And we have to respond. So again, the name of the system is the Emmett Till Security Alert System. It's named after Emmett Till, who, of course, was the teenager that was murdered in Mississippi.
Wow. Thanks for that, Carl. And, Andreas, following up on what Carl just brought up, because that, that segues perfectly into what I think is a companion piece of what's going on. In the state of Texas, in El Paso, Texas, they have targeted and have begun the construction of what will be the largest immigration detention facility in the United States. It's going to cost U.S. taxpayers about $1.25 billion for the construction. And they're calling it it's like a huge tent city, because there are these huge white tents that have been constructed just on the outskirts, really on the corner of a military base that's there in El Paso, Texas. And this facility is going to be built in such